You've got the United States and its allies in the global north on a militaristic war drive against China. And there's a lot of discussion, and this is including amongst US military generals, that the international tensions being stoked up by the United States over Taiwan could escalate into a potential hot war. I just wanted to kind of get your perspective on how real do you think this threat is? And what would you say to people who believe that the US is preparing to defend the freedom of Taiwan as a justification in the mainstream discourse here in the West?
Unless formal Taiwan independence is declared, or if the US reestablishes US military bases on Taiwan, there won't be a hot war. The DPP is also a lot smarter than Ukraine's Zelensky. If war were to break out, the DPP would lose the little support it has left. Remember, although the DPP's Lai Ching-te won the election, it did so with only 40% of the vote. And if we include abstentions, the DPP won with less than 30% of the vote. So why does this matter? Because for Lai Ching-te to declare Taiwan independence, he could go the referendum route, but as you can see, the people don't really support him. Like 70% of the population does not support him. And if we look at the legislature, it's under the control of the opposition, not the DPP. So he cannot go through the legal processes of either abolishing the ROC and establishing a so-called Republic of Taiwan, nor can it redefine the so-called ROC's borders as just the areas directly under Taipei's administration. Now, if war broke out, reunification would be imminent, and the DPP will not have a spot at the negotiation table, which means its political power will come to an immediate end. Now, this is why a lot of more accelerationist mainland Chinese netizens during the election were actually supportive of Lai Ching-te, because they're like, no, we must support the separatists so then they could provoke a war and we could immediately reunify the country. But that's like internet stuff. Like in the real world, I mean, the power play is a lot more calculating, and it's not just a bunch of zealous people on the internet. I think a greater threat by the current leadership with the US behind it is the mismanagement of Taiwan, leading to the cancellation of preferential terms of trade given to Taiwan by the mainland, and a response in kind from the mainland that would decimate Taiwan's economy and standard of living. One example was when Lai Ching-te was inaugurated. He said in his inauguration speech that he hopes China acknowledges the existence of the ROC and that the PRC and the ROC are two separate countries that are not subservient to one another. This is a red line because although it's not Taiwan separatism, it's two China rhetoric, which is a departure from what leaders in the past have said. And of course, after this, the mainland started doing its countermeasures, canceling the remaining preferential terms of trade outlined by the ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. The mainland has everything going on its side, whether it's economy, its position in the global stage, politically, or militarily. Whereas if we look at Russia in the years leading up to the war, it was gradually being pushed into the corner. But in the case of Beijing, time is on its side. Every year looks better for it. So it's not that desperate to launch a war unless very clearly defined red lines are crossed. Now, if war were to break out, the aid coming from the US would be similar to the type of aid going to Ukraine, which is money, weapons, voices of support, thoughts, and prayers. Now, we have to remember that Taiwan is an island, and all it would take for the mainland to secure the situation would be to block the major ports and bomb all the runways. That would be enough to paralyze the Air Force and choke off Taiwan's access to materials. It's much more difficult to maintain a supply line on an island than it is in a country like Ukraine, which borders countries friendly to the US. And because the UN recognizes the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China and Taiwan as a part of China, the PLA, People's Liberation Army, enforcing a blockade in the waters surrounding Taiwan would not be a violation of international law. And I think one would have to be extremely naive to think the US cares about Taiwan in any capacity beyond caring about its geopolitical interests. I mean, you had people like Ramaswamy saying we should defend Taiwan until we can have the chip technology. And once we have the chip technology and it can be manufactured in America, then we should just let Taiwan survive on its own. Now, I don't know if many people know this, but the first country to ever attack Taiwan with a warship was the US in 1867. And the US also supported Japan's attempted invasion of Taiwan in 1874. So to say that the US is ready to defend Taiwan, whatever that means, I think it's quite naive. It's at most willing to defend its interests. And once that's done, anything else is fair game. I'd like to mention how in the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a universal US law that defines the US's relations with the island. Inside this law, inside this act, there is no clause obligating the US to defend Taiwan in a war situation. And the way it's worded is, if there are efforts to determine Taiwan's status by non-peaceful means, then there are matters of grave concern. Now, former Illinois Senator Charles H. Percy proposed changing the wording from matters of grave concern to security interests, but his proposal was shot down because if the wording was changed to security interest, then it would commit the US to war with China should cross-strait antagonisms intensify. Senior Pentagon official Edward Ross said, as the lone superpower, our interests are plentiful and our attention short. We cannot help defend you if you cannot defend yourself, which is why I think you'd have to be very naive to believe the US would commit itself to defending the people on Taiwan in the event of war with the Chinese mainland.